Welcome to the Know Your Faith program, a collaboration of CREDI, the Catholic Religious Education Development Institute, OPPD, Office of Parish Pastoral Development, and CAMSEL, the Catholic Media Services. I am Maria Byron, Director at CREDI, and it is my pleasure and honor to be your moderator again. So viewers, a very special welcome. We are delighted that you're joining us or continuing with us on this journey. I am learning so much. There is so much enlightenment in each presentation as we seek to deepen and strengthen our faith. For those of you who have been following us, I am sure you remember Father Christo's advice. For each session, we need to take breaths, deep breaths, to get ready before we plunge in. So in this session, we introduce another topic and another area of study, hospitality, and our theme, Christian hospitality, a moral obligation. And in this session, our presenter will provide a biblical overview of Christian hospitality. Our presenter for this two-part series is Dr. Adanna James. Adanna is a Belmont girl. That's what she says. She comes from a small family, loves cooking and dancing, and she has worked nearly everywhere and done everything, nearly everything. Belmont girl, huh? Okay. Adanna, however, now works at the seminary of St. John Vianney and the Uganda Martyrs, where she lectures theology, not mathematics, theology. She graduated from Holy Name Convent, then UWI, and the seminary, where she obtained her BA in theology. She then went on to graduate from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, where she completed her master's and PhD in theological ethics. Belmont girl? Adanna is a member of the Secretariat of CTCT, Conference on Theology in the Caribbean Today, an organization dedicated to promoting theology in the Caribbean. Adanna is also a board member of Bethesda, family ministry to persons with disabilities in the Dutch diocese. Her research has been mainly in the area of disability and ethics. Adanna has a deep passion for theology, spirituality, and for teaching, and has been influenced by many, especially her brother Chiron, Canon Nolly Clark, and the late Sister Diane Jagdio. Adanna, Dr. James, Belmont girl.
Adanna, yes.
Welcome. Would you please start us off with a prayer? And then you have our undivided attention.
Thank you so much. And so today we turn to a God of hospitality in one of the prayers that has been given to us as a church to appeal to this hospitable God. So please join with me as we pray the Our Father. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And so, as we appeal to this hospitable God, we will see how God's hospitality encourages us to be hospitable as well. So tonight's topic, Christian hospitality, a moral obligation. Today, I will be doing a biblical overview of Christian hospitality, and we will see how this topic has its deep origins in scriptures. So tonight I will be using the research that has done by Christine Paul, Thomas Reynolds, Jean Vanier, Michel de Vertaille, and the scriptures. So when you hear the term hospitality, what do you think of? Now, did you know that hospitality is something that has a lot of morality attached to it with great serious consequences? That's not something many of us knew. In fact, that's not something I knew of either before I delved into the topic of hospitality. But it really is something that holds deep morality and actually was a great test of being able to determine how good someone was or how evil someone was. However, when we think of hospitality today, what we think of is sitting down in sandals in the Bahamas, stretched out on a lounge chair, somebody bringing us margaritas, or we think of a smiling clerk at a hotel. We kind of think of hospitality in terms of something that's quite light and something where something is being done to get something in return. I mean, you don't get hospitality like that without paying. You know, this is what hospitality has come to mean for us. And even in our communities and in our churches, we have hospitality ministries. And basically, a lot of times it tends to be around dealing with ushering and making sure persons are quite comfortable, also making sure that refreshments are available, which is good. But there might actually be a deeper meaning to this term called hospitality. So the roots of the word hospitality can be traced back to Greek origins, philoxenia. So we kind of know the word xenophobic. I don't know if we kind of remember that. So philoxenia means being a friend to the stranger, love of the stranger, welcome, the art of expressing love and friendship to strangers. So xenos is stranger, philo is love. Now, where we know the term is xenophobia, which is actually the opposite. It's a fear of strangers. So hospitality has its roots in this love of the stranger. So this is actually even a strange kind of concept to what we have now come to know hospitality as, you know. So we will go through the scriptures and see where that comes from. So for that, we need to go to the father of our faith, Abraham. And we would have been going through the stories of Genesis and the story of Abraham as the father of our faith. And we realize that this is a story of a man who was commanded by God to become a stranger. Go from your country, Yahweh said to him, and your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. So, being obedient, as we know of Abraham, he went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien. And it raises the question, why would God want anybody to live like that, to live like an alien, to live like a stranger? I mean, what does it feel like to be a stranger? Why would God want that of anybody? I remember when I was living in Belgium some time ago, what that experience did for me, feeling like a stranger and an outsider. I was not even familiar with the language. I couldn't read the signs. And I really was quite vulnerable to the goodwill of people around me who I did not know. And so it's a situation of a lot of vulnerability. Um, you feel quite frightened, you feel alone, you feel cut off, isolated, and you have to actually rely on others. And for whatever reason, this is the experience that God wanted Abraham eventually to have. And if we continue with this text in Genesis, God says, "Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens too." So God is saying to Abraham that this is actually a legacy that will follow, that your people, even though they will be numerous like the sun, they are actually going to end up being vulnerable strangers in a land that is not theirs and shall be slaves there. And as we continue to go through the texts and the readings of the day, we will be following a story of a people who are living as aliens in a land, living as strangers, and because of that, feeling quite oppressed by those who consider themselves to be the original inhabitants of the land. So when we think about this experience of feeling left out, feeling like an outsider, getting back to that experience, that's really crucial, because what it forces you to do, at least what it forced me to do in Belgium, was to kind of develop some little spaces where I could feel comfortable and feel safe. And it also was a place where I learned to develop spirituality. Prayer became almost something that I would fall into automatically when I'm lost and I look like the only person there who is obviously a stranger. Nobody else looks like me, and you don't know who you can trust. Sometimes you just end up crying out to God, and perhaps this is the experience that God was calling his people to be a part of. Why? So that we could come to rely on God as our benefactor. And basically, this is the lesson that God has tried to teach his people, starting with Abraham and continuing on through the ages, that I, God, will be your real provider and that you should rely on me. And so in that experience of feeling vulnerable and feeling alone, you reach out to God as benefactor. But God is also asking us to kind of look out for each other. So what ended up happening again in Belgium, if I return to that experience, I ended up being part of a community of English speakers. We came from all different parts of the world, some from the Philippines, some from the States, all different parts. But we were able to find that common connection because we were all strangers in a foreign land. And for some strange reason, we ended up coming together quite easily, helping each other out. If somebody heard of a deal somewhere, like, you could get that cheaper here. Or if there was some food that was familiar to some persons, you'd say, well, you could get rice here. And so you end up forming these connections and these networks. And actually, this is what God wanted to create among his people, in the sense of calling his people to be strangers. Now, if we go back to the time of the Old Testament, one of the things that we have to remember is that the idea of being an alien and being on the move was actually not specific to the people of Israel. Ancient Near East, what we now call Middle East, was kind of that kind of culture where people were moving a lot. And so we had that experience where you would at some point in time find yourself as a stranger among others. But what was the difference with the people of Israel is, for whatever reason, it was inscribed in their law. And so the idea of not just being a stranger, but the protection of the stranger was crucial to the people of ancient Israel. And what we would realize is that their identity was being shaped as a people who were to constantly remember that they are vulnerable, that they need each other. And this memory was supposed to fashion how they in turn were to treat others. So just a little backtrack, a little quick insight. If we have to look through the Old Testament and this story of a people moving from being aliens and strangers in the land of Egypt to occupying their own land, we remember the stories of God intervening in the lives of these people through Moses, right? The fantastic stories of how he was able to lead his people away from a situation of slavery and bondage, which is what they were in as they were living as strangers in this land, to move them to a people who would occupy their own land. And so as they were about to enter their land, the elders of the community, the theologians, the spiritual leaders said, you know what? We have been through an incredible experience of moving from that type of bondage, coming through this wandering in the desert where some of our people did not make it, to now finally being able to see this promise that was held out for us for 40 years. And so what did they do? They said, now that we are about to enter this land, we must never forget what brought us here. And so perhaps even now today, we can think about how we can apply that to what is happening in the contemporary world. We are now entering a situation that is historic, and perhaps it might be an opportunity for our elders and for our leaders to sit and think, how did we get here? And what are some of the lessons that we want to take as we step into a new phase? And so this is the thinking behind the people of Israel. And as they go into their new land, how were they to live it? They had to live it with that constant memory that, A, we were once strangers, and it is only through God's grace that we are here, that this land ultimately belongs to God, and that we are just stewards of this land. And for this reason, heavily enshrined in their law was the protection of strangers. And it wasn't just one law. In fact, if we go through scriptures, Deuteronomy, Exodus, Leviticus, what we will find is that there are laws on the care and protection of strangers through all the scriptures. So I'm not really putting up this for you to read it. I'm just putting it up for you to get a sense of the extent to which this was an important concept for the people of Israel. You shall not oppress an alien, for you know the heart of an alien, seeing you were aliens in the land of Egypt. That comes from Exodus 23. Deuteronomy 24, do not deprive the alien or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Deuteronomy 27, cursed is the man who withholds justice from the alien. Exodus 23, you shall not oppress an alien, for you know the heart of an alien, seeing you were aliens in the land of Egypt. So this was an important and crucial concept to the people. And because of that, it had to be inscribed in the law. And there were particular practices that had to go alongside this law. So in some of these laws, it is quite direct: do not mistreat or an alien or oppress him. But there were particular practices that were expected of the people who would carry out these laws, live by these laws. And as I said, because they were a nomadic culture, they were also to be open to persons who would come to them as nomads, as strangers. And so I would quickly like to turn to two stories that would give us an example of the way that persons themselves imbibed this culture of hospitality to the stranger. So Genesis 18 and Genesis 19 offers us the story of Abraham and his relative Lot. Two very famous stories. And in it, you will see how the protection of the stranger was so important. If we look back at the text now, we would probably be shocked at the way that at the kind of hospitable manner that they extended to strangers, people that they did not know. But now we're getting a sense of why, of how deep it was a concept for them to hold on to and what they did with it. So we're going to start with Abraham and Genesis 18. And in that text, you will see that Abraham encounters three strangers. So I'm just going to get that text for you now. And usually it's called, the text is titled, A Son Promised to Abraham. So we just start that. So Abraham was sitting. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw three men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, okay, so the video has gone on a little quicker than I thought. So I'm going to try to get it back here. So they said, "Do as you have said." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to get Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where's your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." So this was a story of Abraham extending fantastic generosity to these 3 strangers. I mean, they even get bread and water, they get bread and lamb, and it was the best. Sarah had to quickly do that. But they didn't just pass on, they left, and they left a blessing. Abraham, in welcoming these strangers, did not know that he was welcoming the presence of the divine. But the presence of the divine was among these strangers. And through Abraham's hospitality to these strangers, Abraham and his wife Sarah were left with a divine blessing. And so, what this story kind of teaches us is that in our extending our hearts and our homes to strangers, we not only welcome strangers, we actually welcome the divine. And this is an important lesson that God would also want his people to know. And this was the way that God was also kind of honoring and looking at what Abraham was doing and saying, yes, this is goodness. This is a community that has welcomed the stranger and has honored what I have asked. And then we go to Genesis 19, which is the story of Lot, Abraham's relative. So these strangers continue on. Two of these strangers continue on to the neighboring village where Lot lived, and we will see what the response to that story was. Now, this is a story that is going to take us to the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And usually when people speak about that story, they are looking at it in terms of a story about morality. Yes, but it's a story on sexual morality, and that's the big story we know. Now, what we are going to be looking at and following is that this story follows immediately after the story of the strangers visiting Abraham and leaving Abraham with a blessing. And then as they go on, one of the strangers, who is identified as the Lord, enters into a dialogue with Abraham, where he says, I am now going down to Sodom to see if the cry that has come out against me, if it really is true, that has come out to me against these people. And what we will see is actually a lesson on hospitality, and that is at the heart of what happens in Sodom. So let's go to that story now in Genesis 19. The depravity of Sodom. So the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. Again, he's following the same tradition that Abraham would have shown. He said, please, my lord, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night. Wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way. They said, no, we will spend the night in the square, but he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. And then he's going to offer something that would seem scandalous to us now, but I will explain why. Look, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they replied, stand back. And they said, this fellow came here as an alien, and he wants to play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. And then they pressed hard against Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here? Daughters, sons-in-law? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against this people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. And so this is the story of what happens with Sodom when the angels or the two strangers arrive at Sodom. And this is an important contrast to look at. So in one instance in Genesis 18, we saw how the strangers were welcomed warmly. And we saw how in the community, if we look at Sarah's community, that the community made sure that these strangers who came into their midst were protected. When those strangers continued on to the village of Lot, what they found was that Lot also blessed them by being hospitable to them. He said, no, you are not to enter into the square. You are to come into my house and you are to receive from me. And they did that. They obliged, but the community was inhospitable to the presence of the strangers. And perhaps this had happened before. And so when that community saw that Lot was being hospitable to the strangers, we realized that a threat wasn't only coming against the strangers, they were threatening Lot himself. They said, let us have our way with them, or else it will be you and them. And so we see that hospitality has a risk attached to it because danger could have befallen Lot as well. Instead, however, the strangers end up protecting Lot as he honored the hospitality that was required of him. And unfortunately, the city ends up being destroyed on account of the judgment that had come against it. So what do these two lessons hold for us and held for the people of Israel and holds for us today? That hospitality had a reward and hospitality had consequences, as did inhospitality. And those consequences were great and severe. And so another story that will perhaps help us to see another side of hospitality, or to continue to see how deep it was as a concept for the people of Israel, is the story of Elijah visiting the widow of Zarephath. So if we look at 1 Kings 17, 8-24, we're going to see in that story the story of the prophet of Elijah, and he is going to a widow of a town that he is not from, and he will be also in a vulnerable position. So just giving you some background to that story of Elijah and his meeting with the widow. Now, Elijah himself was a prophet, and at that time, the story goes in 1 Kings that Israel had come to have inherited a string of leaders that were not following Yahweh's commands. And the worst of them was King Ahab. And Elijah was a prophet during King Ahab's time. And he was tasked with the message to go to Ahab and to tell Ahab, listen, you see all these gods you're worshiping, these gods of rain. I want you to know that there will be no rain in this place until God, the Lord God, Yahweh, says so. And that was the message that Elijah brought to Ahab that did not sit well with Ahab. And so Elijah had to be on the run because he would have been persecuted. And so in this context of Elijah running, of Yahweh threatening to withhold the rain and actually doing it, and resulting in a drought on the place. This is the context and the background for Elijah who is now going to the widow, who God tells him will provide for him during this time. So we go down to that story, the widow of Zarephath. So then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there. So not just pass through, but live there, for I've commanded a widow there to feed you. So he set out and went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel so that I may drink. As she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. But she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am now gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth. She went and did as Elijah said, so that she, as well as he and her household, ate for many days. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. He then said to Elijah, What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. But he said to her, Give me your son. He took him from her bosom, carried him up into the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him on his own bed. He cried out to the Lord, O Lord, my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I am staying by killing her son? Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, O Lord, my God, let this child's life come into him again. The Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. The life of the child came into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, See, your son is alive. So the woman said to Elijah, Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. And so we see some repetitions taking place with this story again. But what we notice with this story in particular, as opposed to the stories of Lot and Abraham, is that this woman had next to nothing. In fact, she said, Listen, I just gathered some sticks here to go and die, because this is it. This is it. I have no more. The drought has affected everyone, and the drought is affecting her particularly bad because she is already a widow, so she lives on her own, and she has this son to look after. And so when Elijah comes into her presence, she is coming with this at the back of her mind. She knows that hospitality must be extended to the stranger, but she also knows that she has next to nothing. And Elijah says, with that next to nothing, still bring me something. I mean, Elijah sounding like some kind of greedy person that just comes to your house totally insensitive. But he is turning to God, the true provider, and he says, you know what? You bring me this, and you will see that your jar of oil and your measure of meal will be multiplied. And so said, so done. So she did receive that blessing. But then there's a strange twist in this story. The widow's son falls ill and dies. And with this, we see that she instantly turns to Elijah and said, look at what happened. I let you into my home, and look at what has happened to me. And again, so we see that risk factor playing out there in terms of this woman extending hospitality. And we also see that when we are with our backs against the wall, sometimes it's easy for us to attack the stranger in our midst, which is what she did with Elijah. And Elijah too was feeling so bad, probably having lived with her for a while. It wasn't just like the angels in Lot's case who were moving on. He was living there for a while he had his own room. You know, he said, God, come on, look at what has happened to this woman while I am living on her hospitality. Please honor her hospitality. And so in the end, we see a story where God listens, honors the hospitality, works this miracle. And again, we see at the end of it, she's recognizing that the divine has come to visit her. She said, truly, you are a man of God. And so what we're going to do right now is to start to kind of bring all of this together and to make it bear on our own lives and our own challenges of hospitality, our own call for hospitality, by entering into a bit of lectio on this said story. And what that would entail is a process of reading scripture where we go slowly with the text, allow it to sit with us and speak with us and see what it is asking of us. And so based on the teachings of Michel de Vertaille, the late Michel de Vertaille, we're going to enter into that process now, again with this text. I'm going to go slower. I'm not going to read the text again, but going to remember the text as we recall the images. So right now, I just would like you to sit with these images and let the story kind of play over in our mind again. So remember that Elijah has to go to this widow. Elijah is in need, but so too is this widow. And we see that he makes a demand of her that she probably finds too much. I don't have anything. I only have for me and my son now. Still bring something for me, Elijah says. She obeys. She brings the last of what she has. And Elijah says, trust me. As God lives, your jar will not be empty of oil, and you will have enough flour. And it was true. She trusted, she did what this stranger said, and she saw the blessings multiply before her eyes. But then something bad and terrible came upon her. And she looked around and she said, the only different thing that has happened in my life is that I have opened up and let this stranger in. And this is what has happened because of what I have done. Yet God hears the prayer of the prophet, and God hears her prayer. The son is healed and brought back to life. So as we just read the text again slowly and we tried to allow it to sit with us, the next stage of doing this lectio is to recognize our experience in the text. And so if I were to share from my own experience in terms of how this text speaks to me, what comes to mind is that being on your last. I actually had an experience of that during this time of COVID. So during this time of COVID, a lot has happened in terms of my own family situation, where I'm now helping to take care of someone who is elderly in the family. And that requires certain resources. And because of that, and because of all the other things that I found that I had to do, meaning rent and just a whole lot of other things that had happened, I found myself in a situation where I was really counting dollars and cents. And actually, after this situation, I remember I invited a friend and we went through our budget one day, and I realized that I had $200 left at the end of the month. And I said, wow, well, I have to hold on to that $200 because in case anything happens. And I remember that we went into the second lockdown, and my mind immediately went on a friend of mine who I knew would have been terribly affected. And I felt like I couldn't give anything. So I kind of rallied support and I called other friends to see if they could help her out. I remember when I went there to drop off the hamper, I had $200 with me, but I said to myself, I can't possibly give her this because this is the last, what will happen to me? And I don't know, but some movement happened within me, and I just said, here, hold that for the time being. She was more than grateful for it. And I knew that I would have been taken care of, and I was. But what was at the heart of that movement was the time that I had just come back home from being abroad and had found myself unemployed. And I remember that feeling of vulnerability. And when we are vulnerable, we actually don't want to ask for help. So this person didn't ask me for help. I heard her situation and I offered. And I remember that I would walk around feeling almost sorry for myself, and people would give to me, and I would say to myself, I can't take from them because they have next to nothing. But in that, I then went on to see the God being benefactor through these persons who were giving to me and through my vulnerability. And I realized that it was that memory that was now driving me forward to give and to trust in that giving, that God's divine presence would be there. And so that's what really occurred to me as I read this text. And so as we go through that text, it should kind of make us think about if it reminds us of anything in our personal life, in the lives of people around us, in the lives of our communities or nation. And here I'd probably like to invite Maria into the discussion. I don't know, Maria, if this text brought anything to mind in terms of what we've been discussing so far. I think you're muted, Maria.
It's just been very, reflective. And I can think of many, examples in my personal life as I was growing up and having people help. Because there were times when I had, and that time you didn't know what a 10 cents was, but 10 cents is what I got for lunch. And I had to either use the other 10 cents to add to the lunch and then walk home, or hope that there was a taxi driver who used to shout out my name, not Maria, but Maria. And that used to make me want to, but I used to be so happy to see him because I knew that if I went in his taxi, he didn't take the fare.
Wow.
So I had this spend the 10 cents and get a better lunch, or hold the 10 cents and hear Maria. So, and that, at times you realize how grateful you are and what blessings there are in what people do for you without you, and how that was a type of hospitality that he was reaching out to me, and I was wondering, should I accept it or not? And I mean, for him, it was just goodwill. So we're in the text there, you know, I'm looking at the meal, that little bit of bread, and I'm saying to myself, if she's going to share this, then there has to be a level of sacrifice. There has to be a level of denial.
Yeah.
But what we realized is that in the sacrifice of letting that bread stretch, as it were, the stretching out brought grace to her. Because on your screen there, you're saying we recognize the story of grace. And it seems as if, you know, we are hospitable, we give from what we do not have. It cannot be from our excess, because if we give from the excess, there's no denial and there'll be no grace.
Wow, wow, that is really something true. I'm glad that you brought that up, and it also makes me think of the fact that there is always a risk with hospitality. You know, so there's risk and there's this denial. So hospitality is not an easy thing to do.
Right. And we are being asked to be hospitable to the migrants, to the strangers. And you say to yourself, but I have this little bit, then I should give it to the people I know. Why do I want to give it to the migrants? Why not? But there's even greater grace, because where maybe the people you know have a neighbor that they can get from, these migrants have no one to turn from. They're in a strange land, an alien land.
Yes. And also, without our knowing, we see that the presence of the divine is there as well. And actually, this would probably take us quite nicely to the second part of this, which we will go to next week, when we will see the concept of stranger gets extended. It's not just those who we don't know, but we realize that alienation and isolation is happening in our own families sometimes, right in our neighborhoods, that kind of thing.
And I like, Adanna, how on your slide you have extended it into nature, because maybe just the yard outside or the savannah or the forest in front of us is a stranger. We're treating it as strangers. We're not hospitable. But we're going to leave that for your next session, where I'm sure you're going to, you know, really pull that together for us. So it is that time, you know, we were having fun, but it's time to wrap up. And there were some other points I would have liked to raise on the Lexio, but let's wrap up. So would you like to make a closing comment? What would you like viewers to remember, to reflect on? I know I've got a lot to reflect on, but we want them to reflect on as we prepare for the next session.
So I guess some takeaway points would be that hospitality is not just a nice extra thing to do. It was a deep sign of morality for the people of Israel, that it was connected to the love of the stranger among us, not just about friends and family. It was connected deeply to who Israel knew themselves to be, their identity. They remembered that they were once strangers in a foreign land, left vulnerable, dependent, and relying on the hospitality of others and on God. And that this was the basis for their treatment of others. It was inscribed into the law of the land, and that there were consequences for one's hospitality, in hospitality and for one's hospitality. Divine blessings or divine judgment. And I guess the last point that I would like to leave is this whole concept of the stranger among us, you know. And I am again saying that I'm going to be bringing this up in the New Testament look, because then we would see Christ really making the demand of us in terms of looking beyond not just the stranger, the actual stranger, but realizing that many persons are falling into this category of stranger: the disabled, the sinner, the orphan, the widow, they are all alienated, and because of that, strangers. So perhaps we can take this during that period and think of it in our own context of all the little strangers among us, perhaps in our own home, in our own families. Our spouses are strangers, or children are strangers, or parents are strangers. We live as strangers, we don't know our neighbors. So that topic of being a stranger and feeling that kind of alienation, we're going to address that in our next segment next week.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. James. Viewers, what did I say? I had warned you to take some deep breaths, and I hope you did. Remember that this presentation and all the presentations in this Know Your Faith program can be viewed on Catholic TT, Trinity TV, and YouTube anytime. Please share the information with a friend, your parish community, and anyone whom we can accompany on this faith formation journey. Christian hospitality, not an obligation, but a moral obligation. Sorry, I should say not optional. Huh?
Yeah,
Correct me there.
yes.
Not optional, but a moral obligation. At the next session, our Belmont girl will take us into the deep again when she puts right up in our face, put it up on your face, as it were, on a placard that reads, "From hugs to hugs." And Dr. James Adanna, you will really be challenging our definition, our understanding, and our practice of Christian hospitality.
Thank you so much.
So, viewers, you can't miss the session. We invite you to join us then. And until then, be blessed and be safe. Adanna, thanks again for this really very reflective, meditative presentation. Have a good day.
Thank you, Maria.